This comparative study applies Lacanian psychoanalytical film theory to Hereditary and A Tale of Two Sisters, examining how family trauma destabilizes identity through the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freud's ideas about the unconscious, arguing that identity is not stable but constructed through psychological and social systems. Writing in the mid-20th century, Lacan proposed that human subjectivity is shaped through language, perception, and symbolic structures. His theories later became influential in psychoanalytical film theory, where cinema is examined as a medium that reveals unconscious fears, desires, and identity conflicts. Lacan proposed that identity operates through three interconnected systems known as the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary relates to illusion and misrecognition, where individuals construct identity through distorted perception. The symbolic represents social structures such as language, authority, and family hierarchy. The real refers to trauma that cannot be fully explained or contained within language. Hereditary, directed by Ari Aster in 2018, is an American psychological horror film that follows the Graham family as they begin to unravel after the death of their secretive grandmother. As grief intensifies, the family begins to uncover disturbing aspects of their ancestry and the psychological toll of unresolved trauma. A Tale of Two Sisters, directed by Kim Ji-woon in 2003, is a South Korean psychological horror film that follows two sisters returning home after the time spent in a psychiatric hospital. Their return home gradually reveals tensions within the household and exposes the psychological consequences of repression and guilt. Although both films explore psychological trauma within the family, they emerge from distinct cultural contexts. Hereditary reflects anxiety surrounding generational trauma within the American nuclear family, a theme that became increasingly prominent in American horror cinema during the early 21st century. In contrast, A Tale of Two Sisters draws on Confucian traditions of family hierarchy and obedience in Korean society, where maintaining respect and emotional restraint within the household can intensify the repression of psychological conflict. The justification for this comparative study is that, despite different cultural contexts, both films use psychological horror to expose how the breakdown of family authority leads to fractured identity. Through Lacan's three orders, this comparison demonstrates how American and South Korean cinema externalize trauma differently, yet reveal similar anxieties about grief, repression, and instability within the family. In this upcoming comparative study, we will use Lacan's framework to analyze how each film represents identity fractured through three central dynamics: distorted perception within the imaginary, repression and family authority within the symbolic, and psychological rupture through encounters with the real. The first analytical pillar examines Lacan's concept of the imaginary. In Lacanian theory, the imaginary refers to illusion, misrecognition, and the unstable construction of identity through images. In Hereditary, the imaginary emerges through Annie's miniature models, which recreate moments from her family life in meticulous detail. By constructing these small-scale environments, Annie attempts to visually reorganize traumatic events and impose a sense of order on experiences that feel emotionally chaotic. Lacan's concept of misrecognition becomes very visible here, as Annie interprets her grief through these images rather than confronting the instability within her own household. The miniatures transform painful memories into controlled visual objects, creating the illusion that trauma can be understood and contained. This visual reconstruction therefore reflects Annie's psychological attempt to stabilize her identity after the loss of her mother. The models also frame the family as objects within a controlled environment, reinforcing how Annie attempts to understand her trauma through representation rather than reality.
I don't like this.
A similar dynamic appears in A Tale of Two Sisters, where the narrative is filtered through Sumi's unstable perception of events within the family home. Rather than presenting reality objectively, the film gradually reveals that Sumi's understanding of the household is shaped by unresolved trauma and emotional repression. Within Lacan's imaginary order, identity becomes unstable when individuals interpret events through subjective projections rather than external reality. Sumi's hostility toward her stepmother therefore reflects a psychological reconstruction of events that allows her to displace guilt and grief onto another figure. The film's perspective aligns the audience with Sumi's perception, encouraging viewers to initially accept her interpretation of the household. This narrative alignment demonstrates how the imaginary can distort both personal identity and the perception of others within the family structure. Both films therefore illustrate Lacan's concept of the imaginary through characters who reconstruct reality in response to trauma. In Hereditary, Annie attempts to visually control grief through miniature representations of her family life. In A Tale of Two Sisters, Sumi interprets the household through psychologically distorted perception. In both cases, illusion becomes a coping mechanism that temporarily protects the characters from confronting the deeper psychological consequences of their trauma. The second analytical pillar examines Lacan's concept of the symbolic order. In Lacanian theory, the symbolic refers to the systems of authority, language, and social rules that organize identity within society, and particularly within the family structure. In Hereditary, the symbolic order appears unstable as the Graham family struggles to maintain authority and communication after the grandmother's death. Lacan defines the symbolic as a system of language, law, and family hierarchy through which individuals understand their roles within society, yet within the Graham household these structures begin to collapse. The tense dinner confrontation between Annie and Peter shows how parental authority fails to control emotional conflict as grief and resentment surface without any stabilizing structure. This breakdown reflects anxiety surrounding the American nuclear family, a model that became dominant during the post-World War II suburban expansion of the 1950s when federal housing programs promoted the ideal of a two-parent household raising children in suburban homes. By the early 21st century, American media increasingly explored fears about the instability of this family structure and the impact of inherited trauma. In Hereditary, these cultural anxieties appear within the Graham household itself, where the family home becomes a central site of conflict and the characters remain trapped within the cycle of inherited grief and psychological instability. In A Tale of Two Sisters, the symbolic order is shaped by strict family hierarchy within the household. Lacan describes the symbolic as a system of authority, language, and social rules that structure identity, and it's represented through the father and the stepmother figures who attempt to maintain control over the family. South Korean family structures have historically been influenced by Confucian philosophy, which was adopted during the Joseon dynasty from 1392 to 1897, and emphasized obedience to elders and the preservation of hierarchy within the household. Even in modern South Korea, these traditions continue to influence expectations of respect and authority within families. In A Tale of Two Sisters, this cultural structure appears in the father's dominant authority and the expectation that the daughter should remain obedient and emotionally restrained. However, the film reveals how this rigid hierarchy suppresses emotional expression and intensifies psychological repression as unresolved trauma continues to shape the household despite the appearance of social order. Both Hereditary and A Tale of Two Sisters illustrate how Lacan's symbolic order collapses when family authority fails to regulate psychological conflict. In Hereditary, the Graham family's breakdown reveals how the structure of the American nuclear family becomes unable to contain grief and inherited trauma. The failure of communication between Annie and Peter demonstrates how emotional conflict replaces the stabilizing role that family hierarchy is meant to provide. In A Tale of Two Sisters, authority also fails, but within a more rigid structure, influenced by Confucian traditions of obedience. The father and stepmother attempt to maintain control within the household, yet the strict hierarchy suppresses emotional expression. Although the cultural structures differ, both films reveal that when the family authority collapses, trauma destabilizes identity and the symbolic order breaks down. Pillar 3 is the real. In Lacanian theory, the real refers to moments of trauma that cannot be fully explained, symbolized, or contained within language or social structure. In both films, these moments emerge when the family can no longer repress grief and psychological conflict. In Hereditary, Lacan's concept of the real emerges when the Graham family can no longer repress the trauma that defines their relationships. The real refers to experiences that cannot be fully explained or contained within language or social order. After Charlie's death, grief overwhelms the family and destroys any remaining stability within the household. Annie's emotional breakdowns and Peter's disassociation reveals how trauma exceeds the symbolic order and destabilizes identity. This reflects broader themes in American psychological horror during the 2010s, which frequently explored inherited trauma and the fear that psychological suffering passes across generations. Director Ari Aster has described the film as a story about a family that is destroyed by grief, emphasizing how emotional trauma slowly dismantles the structure of the household. In Hereditary, the family home becomes the central site where this trauma resurfaces, transforming the domestic space into one where grief cannot be controlled or explained. The real, therefore, appears when the Graham family can no longer contain the psychological consequences of their past. In A Tale of Two Sisters, Lacan's concept of the real emerges when the psychological illusion surrounding the household can no longer be maintained. The real refers to trauma that resists explanation and disrupts the systems of meaning created by the imaginary and symbolic orders. Throughout the film, Sumi's perception of the house is shaped by guilt and fragmented memory, but moments involving the father reveal the underlying emotional reality of the family. His distant silence and inability to confront the situation expose how deeply the trauma has been repressed within the household. When the illusion of the family dynamic collapses, the characters are forced to confront the truth of their past rather than the version that is constructed through Sumi's perception. Director Kim Ji-woon has described the film as a story centered on emotional pain within the family, and he presents this through restrained performances in quiet domestic spaces that gradually reveal the psychological weight carried by the characters. In this way, the real appears when the family can no longer sustain the illusion of harmony and the underlying trauma becomes unavoidable. Both films present Lacan's concept of the real as the moment when psychological trauma can no longer be contained by family structure or perception. In Hereditary, the Graham family repression of grief ultimately collapses as inherited trauma overwhelms their relationships and destroys any remaining stability within the household. In A Tale of Two Sisters, the real emerges when the emotional illusion surrounding the family breaks apart and the truth behind Sumi's perception becomes unavoidable. While Aster portrays this rupture through escalating emotional breakdown and chaotic psychological collapse, Kim Ji-woon presents it through quiet revelation and restrained domestic tension. Despite these stylistic differences, both films reveal that when trauma finally resurfaces, the structures meant to protect the family are unable to contain it. Through Lacanian psychoanalytical film theory, both Hereditary and A Tale of Two Sisters demonstrate how family trauma destabilizes identity across the imaginary, symbolic, and real orders. In Hereditary, illusion first appears through attempts to control grief, while the collapse of parental authority exposes the instability of the family structure. In A Tale of Two Sisters, distorted perception and rigid household hierarchy both attempt to contain trauma, yet repression ultimately intensifies psychological conflict. Across both films, the imaginary reveals the illusion, the symbolic exposes the fragility of family authority, and the real emerges when trauma can no longer be contained. While Aster presents this breakdown through escalating psychological chaos. Kim Ji-woon portrays it through restrained revelation and emotional repression. Despite their different cultural contexts, both films reveal how unresolved grief ultimately fractures identity and destroys the structures meant to stabilize the family. Ultimately, by examining Hereditary and A Tale of Two Sisters through Lacan's imaginary, symbolic, and real, it becomes clear that both films use psychological horror to reveal how unresolved family trauma destabilizes identity and fractures the structure meant to contain it.